This webinar on governance in Microsoft 365. It's my pleasure today to have Peter Badley from Snap-on Software join us. Snap-on's been a new name for a company that's been around for a while. There's 3 different companies, and Peter's going to do a little intro on that shortly. Just a quick bit of housekeeping. We will be recording the session today. Mel will make the recording available after the webinar, so it normally takes us a couple of days just to get our show together and get that out to people with a follow-up. And as I said, if there's any questions, just pop those in the chat and we'll pick those up as we go through. Would you better pop to the next slide, please, Peter? So today's topic, we're going to cover a few things on our agenda. So I'm going to talk, just do a quick introduction. So I'll introduce Stratus and Snap-on Software and Peter. And we'll talk a little bit about the challenges that we have administering Microsoft 365. Today we're focusing on a tool called ProvisionPoint. So we'll be giving you an overview of ProvisionPoint. Peter's going to take us through a case study from Wessex Water. We're going to talk about the tackling team sprawl, some of the solo administrator problems. So how do we actually keep on top of the environment and save ourselves some time? And then we're going to end on a real highlight, which will be rapid provisioning of projects. And there's some really cool stuff in there. So if you wait to the end, you'll see some really good functionality. And ProvisionPoint, something that we've been looking at for a while. We're really it's a best of breed product, which is why we have Peter here today. So just a quick background on Stratus for those of you that don't know us. We're SharePoint and Power Platform experts based in Christchurch. We do all kinds of things related to SharePoint, Microsoft Teams, and Power Platform. Some of the things that we do are on this slide here. We work with lots of different organisations across New Zealand and Australia in lots of different industries, including local government, private enterprises, manufacturing, construction, healthcare, engineering, education, I should say, and much more. So if the word SharePoint pops into your head, or Power Apps and Power Automate, that's us. We're happy to talk. So I'll hand you over to Peter.
Yeah, so a little bit about Snap-on Software. As Steve said, we're a new brand. It's actually bringing together 3 different product brands within the App Efficiency group. So Quiz or Quizcom, which makes collaboration products for SharePoint and Teams, including things like forms and data visualizations. ProvisionPoint, which we're focusing on today, which is a governance solution for Microsoft 365. We'll talk a little bit more about its capabilities in the future as we go through the webinar today. And then our ISST brand, which covers NetSuite products. We brought this brand together to sort of showcase our capabilities to deliver a range of products across software ecosystems. If you've worked with any of these teams before, it's the same people, but trying to deliver a consistent brand and a consistent experience to our customers to deliver new products and solutions and enhance our existing ones. As for me, I'm the Director of Sales and Client Solutions at Snap-on Software. My background is actually pretty technical. I've been working with Microsoft 365 and SharePoint on premises before that for about 20 years, firstly as a consultant, then in the product space, and more recently leading the Sales and Client Solutions team. Oh, that's gone the wrong way. Let's go back that way. There we go.
So one of the reasons why I invited Peter along to speak today was because I see a lot of challenges across many of our clients where we have a Microsoft 365 administrator who simply has too many tasks in their day. Often they're the only person doing that role. And sometimes it's only part of their role. They've got other things to do for these New Zealand-sized organisations. And so what we tend to see is that they're too busy to have time to learn how to automate and be more efficient at what they're doing. And that's what the value proposition really is for ProvisionPoint. It's here to save you a lot of time and also to improve the governance of your environment. So making sure that it's set up the way that you expect it to be set up, and that once it's set up, it's maintained. And so today, when we go through the webinar, you'll see features and functionality that help do all of those kind of tasks that are sometimes very onerous and time consuming, or we just don't get to. So everything from requesting new SharePoint sites and team sites, managing our existing environment to ensure it's compliant with the rules that we've set for ourselves, identifying and managing inactive sites and content, and all of the security compliance capabilities or requirements that we have, especially with things like Copilot now, where people are now more concerned about who can see content than previously. So you'll see a whole lot of functionality demonstrated today that tries to answer those key points. So that's kind of the context I'd like you to have a look at this webinar through. And I'll hand over to Peter now, and he'll just take us through a demo. We'll go through to about 11:15, and we'll have time for questions. So if you do have one, please pop them in the chat.
Thanks, Steve. So firstly, to introduce ProvisionPoint in a little bit more detail, we're a governance solution for Microsoft 365, focusing on Microsoft Teams, Microsoft 365 groups, SharePoint sites. We also cover other workloads like Viva Engage. The core capabilities which we provide in that governance offering is provisioning. That's really about empowering self-service. So instead of a ticket being logged and that has to then go to that administrator to set up, and it might not get set up for a couple of days, and it takes that person several hours to set it up because they have to run through lots of steps, run scripts, other things like that. It's actually letting your end users do that, but within some guardrails and some controls. Lifecycle management to help you keep on top of Sprawl. If your environment, if you've got, I speak to customers every day who have got hundreds of sites or teams in their environment, and they're sure that many of those are not being used. So we can clean up an environment, and we can also make sure it's kept tidy. And then we have our compliance and audit capabilities, which allow for continually monitoring risks. Steve mentioned Copilot, dealing and tackling with things like oversharing, orphan sites and teams. So we'll show you a few examples of those. And then on top of that, we have a range of reporting and dashboarding capabilities for that administrator to better get control of their environment. And ProvisionPoint works for organizations of all sizes. It can be, you can maybe only have a few hundred users or even a couple of thousand users, or we have customers with tens of thousands of users. The administrative challenges are the same. Some common use cases, we mentioned self-service request. In the second part of the demonstration today, we'll look at project lifecycle control. So actually creating projects and managing their lifecycle, cleaning up your environment, archiving content, but also retaining content. I know a lot of organizations within the government space and also regulated industries need to ensure that things like retention labels are applied, sensitivity labels are applied, and the correct record management controls are applied. So ProvisionPoint can also support with that. I wanted to bring a case study to this group today. So Wessex Water is a utilities water company based in the UK. They're one of the longest serving ProvisionPoint customers. So they've been using it for more than 8 years now. They started off before Teams even existed, so using it for managing SharePoint as they migrated from on premises to online, and they had several thousand users using SharePoint. The big challenge for them was relatively small IT team, one primary administrator of SharePoint, but the organization needed to be regularly creating new sites and as they move forwards, teams. And these were quite templated. They were for projects. They were creating 10 to 15 sites, sometimes more a week. And on average, it was taking several hours for an administrator to go through that process of setting that site up. As they've moved forwards, they've also been able to put controls in place for things like Sprawl to archive sites and teams once they finish their project lifecycle. But what they really got was a predefined control process for users to self-serve creating new sites and teams, but within controls which the administrators and the IT team were happy with. So at the moment, they've got close to sort of 2,000 sites managed by ProvisionPoint. They've expanded that to use and cover teams, but it's very low touch. It's something which has survived organizational transitions. So the original administrator moved on to a different role. They've had multiple different people come and leave the company or interact with the system in an administrative role, and they've all been able to take that on and manage that effectively. So whilst there's been some change in the organization, there's been a consistency from the governance solution throughout. That case study is published on our website, and if anyone's interested in reading more of that, it's something which we can share. But it's a really great use case of how an organization has identified one key need, but then managed and grown with a tool like ProvisionPoint to ensure that their governance is ongoing. I'm going to go through two use cases today. The first one, which Steve mentioned, was the solo administrator. So a little bit similar to the Wessex Water. This is perhaps now one of the most common use cases we get asked, that the environment's got out of control, teams sprawl, they can't manage the creation of teams because it either takes them too long to do it, or they've just let users create stuff. There's lots of duplications, sites and teams created which only have one owner, teams which never actually get any usage, data not being archived. And in the era of AI and Copilot, that becomes a real problem, because how can we ensure that our users are getting accurate answers if there's lots of old data in the system? Or worse, that we're giving or using information which is wrong, using guidance, instructions from policies from teams which should have been archived a long time ago. So really the core requirements which we're going to focus on today are, firstly, cleaning up the environment. We'll have a look at some of our policies which have run in an environment, identifying things like inactive workspaces, workspaces with only one owner. It's a common problem when someone leaves the organization. Who's going to manage that site or team if they leave the organization? Who's going to be responsible for the security? Who's going to be responsible for the archiving? We'll also look at examples of things like inactive guests to show that these guest users haven't logged in for a certain period of time, again representing a risk to that environment. So we'll look at how we can proactively see what's going on. We'll then have a look at the policies which we can implement, so things like lifecycle policies to automate the archiving of sites and teams, as well as those ongoing compliance policies and how they're configured. And then we'll also look at putting guardrails in place around the provisioning process. We'll clean up the environment, but we'll also want to make sure that moving forwards that users follow a more structured process to request new teams. So I'm going to switch over to my demo, and I'm logged into ProvisionPoint at the moment as an administrative user. This means that I get insights into the environment. I can see a summary and a breakdown of my environment, which you see here via my dashboard. I'll just refresh my screen because it seems to have cached a little bit. So we'll just wait for that to load up again. And then here we go. So I get a breakdown of my environment. This gives me insights in terms of things like how is my environment broken down by sites, teams, different template types, how it's also secured in things like privacy, external sharing, sensitivity labels, and I can even drill into this to see my data and export it for further reporting and analysis. So this gives me, in these dashboards, give me a great overview of my environment. But if I actually want to understand in my environment where there are risks and issues, I can actually do that via our policies. So we can schedule regular policies to run in my environment, which go through and look and check for various things like usage of my sites and teams, as well as potential risks. So I've got a few which are running here, and found a couple of recent examples. So blue means everything's good. Grey means that there's a section or number of sites and teams which potentially represent a risk or an issue. So here I've got a policy looking at workspace usage. I can see that some of those are compliant, they're active, some of those are non-compliant. I can drill into this and look at it in more detail, and I can see for that policy run, these two sites are active, but these ones are not. I can export this data, or I can drill into a specific workspace and understand why. And in this case, it's because no one's accessed it within the time frame which I've defined. If I go and look at a different policy run, so for example, let's go and find one with my orphaned workspaces. Here I can go in and do something very similar. In this case, one of those is non-compliant. And why is that? It's because this particular user, Nesta, has left the organization. Now, according to my policies, which I've defined, I now need to go and do something about this. I need a different owner assigned. And with these policies in ProvisionPoint, you can choose to do one of three things. Firstly, you can deliver these scheduled reports like I'm showing you here to administrators or other compliance managers within your organization. Secondly, you can send notifications to either the administrators or even the other owners of the team about risks or issues. Or thirdly, you can take proactive action. So an example might be here, I've got a policy which looks at sharing and issues around sharing in my workspaces. And this particular one, I've identified a guest user which is inactive. So my policies could automate and go and remove that guest user, go and remove the disabled owner, or for an inactive workspace, trigger a process to start the archiving and disposal of that workspace. It's entirely up to you whether you just want to get insights and then be able to take more informed action, or actually let ProvisionPoint proactively govern your environment and clean that environment up, remove those risks, and also go ahead and archive new workspaces. As well as looking at general scheduled runs, I can get a more detailed summary by actually just drilling in and saying, well, if I want to go and look at a specific policy, let's just go and look at a specific policy and say, well, actually, I'm interested in my workspace usage policy. And this will then give me all of the workspaces which have been identified as inactive. Now, this is my own tenant and I don't log in here very often, so you can see it's not a very compliant tenant, but this is really useful for me. I can export this, I can drill in and understand why, and go and take some action based on that. And I can actually go and even come in here and understand more about it. And I can even come in here and go and click on this workspace and see more about who are the owners of that workspace and go and engage with them if I want to. Again, whether we want to be proactive or whether we want to just give me the data to make decisions. The other type of policy which we have running in our environment is lifecycle policies. So these are automated policies to go ahead and remove workspaces or take some other form of lifecycle action. That could be archiving, that could be calling external cold storage solution like Microsoft Archive. It could be deleting unused workspaces and teams. These policies can either be triggered based on time or based on activity. So for example, in a project, we might say after a year, we want this project archived. Alternatively, we might say any teams which haven't been active for the last 60 days, we're going to start a process to archive them and maybe remove them. And we can engage the site or team owner to go and take some action based on those. So for example, if I take this one here, I can go in and I actually can see that this team has now been deleted. But the great thing about ProvisionPoint is it keeps that history. So I can come in here and I can see the timeline of activities which happened. I can also see the life cycle stages which it followed. So that history is retained, but it's automated that process to go and clean up my sites and teams. So these reports and capabilities give us great insight into what's happening in my environment and automate that cleanup. You can deploy this to your tenant today, or maybe not today, but maybe tomorrow, and get it to start to clean up your environment. How do we configure these policies? These are easy to configure in ProvisionPoint. Let's look at each one in turn. So the lifecycle policies, They can be triggered either based on a time. So in this case, this one triggers based on an end date, but it can also be triggered based on activity or lack of activity. We can then define a number of stages. So in my case, mine's got two stages. When expiry occurs, it will archive it. It will set it to be read-only. It will hide it. And then 30 days later, it will go ahead and delete it. I can go and modify these actions. So for example, I can go and say, well, actually, I want a longer period of time before I delete it. I want to change that to 90 days. I want to configure reminders to go to my owners of my team 10 days before the team expires, and then remind them again 5 days later. So I can configure and notify them to go and take action. And I'll show you a little bit later how they can actually choose to extend that for longer. We support a range of actions, as I say, like archive, delete, move to cold storage, remove sharing, modify permissions. So a variety of actions and can be built up of multiple stages. You can assign different policies to different types or groups of teams. So you might say these projects have a lighter or quicker expiry process than something which is used for more corporate document management. The other type of policies are compliance policies. These are configurable policies, and I'll zoom in a little bit on this screen because my screen's quite big. And you can define a range of different policies to go and start monitoring your environment and taking action. So for example, here I've got one which looks at inactive workspaces. It looks for any sites which have been sites or teams which have been modified, which haven't been modified in the last 30 days, or which haven't been accessed in the last 15 days. If neither of those rules are achieved, then it's deemed as non-compliant and flagged and may start an expiry process. Again, these criteria can be changed to whatever you define it to be. Oversharing, I can go and look for things like inactive guest users, haven't logged in within the last 30 days. Again, that's configurable. Or where external sharing of that site or team, that setting doesn't meet my requirement. Or look for things like inactive owners, incorrectly named sites or teams. And we can go in and define the individual rule sets here. So for example, we can say inactive in my scenario means 60 days. This is all configurable. And you can also define different things. So I mentioned with each rule, you can go and look at, well, what is it I'm looking at? So for example, do I just want to report an owner which is blocked from signing in, so no longer part of the organization? Do I want to notify someone, or do I want to take an appropriate form of action, such as remove that owner, replace them with someone else? Exactly the same principle with usage as well. Do I want to just report it, or do I want to actually start a expiry process? So we can define these policies, and we can link one or more to our sites and teams, and they run on a scheduled basis to check for risks and issues within my environment. So by configuring these policies initially, we get an opportunity to clean up our environment, and then ongoing, these policies will run on a schedule which we define to go and check and take action or notify me of risks. This is where it's really powerful, because as an administrator, I don't need to worry about this. ProvisionPoint's doing the job for me, and then I can take action based on what I see. Let's go and have a quick look at how we then put in place some guardrails to actually put some controls on this moving forward. So we've got our policies, but actually, ideally, we don't want people creating sites or teams which are non-compliant in the first place. So I'm going to switch over to another user. I'm switched over to an end user now, and they can work with the ProvisionPoint app in two different experiences. They can work with it in the web browser, and they can also work with it through the Teams app, which you see here. I can come in and I can request a new site or team, and I can request it from predefined templates. The great thing about these templates is it puts your controls in place from the start, so you don't have to keep constantly cleaning up your environment once you've cleaned it up the first time. So for example, this one, apply certain controls. It's saying that this is the sensitivity I'm going to apply. It's going to be private. Guest access is going to be disabled. External sharing is disabled. Whereas this one is for external collaboration. And we can see it's got a different sensitivity and it's enabled for sharing. These may have different approval and authorization paths because they're shared externally. They might have different expiry processes. Let's go and create a new team. So let's say I'm creating one for some market research. As part of the provisioning process, we can also ask users for additional metadata. This is really relevant for the second use case, which we'll come to, because it can help us control how that site or team is going to be created. So I can go and tag that information. This is entirely configurable. Another great example of how we can put controls in from the start is we can say, actually, we need 2 owners to create this team. So I'm required to add another owner, otherwise it won't let me create it. So we can enforce those controls, those standards, which we're trying to do. had to put in place to clean up our environment. We can assign that expiry policy, which we see here, and we can even ask users to accept certain terms or agreements before they go ahead and create that team. I'm going to go ahead and click request here, and I use the term request because one of the things on one of the guardrails you can put in place, dependent on your template, is an approval process. So we see that here. This request is pending approval, so my team hasn't started to create. If I move back to my admin user, you'll see that I've received a approval request notification, currently an email coming really soon to Teams as well. And I also receive a notification within the ProvisionPoint app. I can go ahead and approve that request, and my team will start creating. As part of these approval process, that can go to a user's manager. It could go to a group of users like the IT security team or a compliance team. It could be dynamic based on the request and the metadata which is provided. That allows us to put in place a single or a multi-stage approval process. Maybe only some types of teams, maybe teams which are externally shared, are the ones which require approval. So to end the journey of our first use case, and I'll just return to the slides for a moment, this is how we can tackle that solo administrator challenge, is the fact that we can get insight into our current environment with our policies and our reports. We can put guardrails in place with the provisioning process I've briefly shown you, and we can sustain our compliance with our automated policies and lifecycle rules moving forward. The other use case, and these may come hand in hand, or you may only have one of those, is about project workspace provisioning. So I briefly showed you the process of provisioning a workspace just because I wanted to start that process and I could talk around it. As in the Wessex Water case, but as in many other cases, we have clients who want to create hundreds or even sometimes thousands of sites and teams to support projects. They want them created consistently. They want them created without errors. And so what we're looking at delivering is pre-configured templates with certain layouts, libraries, lists. We want consistent structure with naming, taxonomy, metadata categorization. And we also want to leverage some of that labeling capability from Purview. I showed how you could tag the sensitivity of a site or team, but what about the sensitivity or retention of our documents? A lot of organizations, as I mentioned, in the government or compliance sector space need to ensure that documents are retained for a certain period of time. So how can ProvisionPoint help with all of that? Let's have a little look again at our templates, and we'll look at, from an administrator perspective, how we go about configuring a template and applying some of those settings and controls. So I'll take this template which we use, which is the external project. As I mentioned, we can control the type of workspace we're creating, so a site, a group, a team, etc. We can then define what's included. So we can define a structure. We can define default channels, standard, private, shared channels, so a predefined structure in teams for our project. We can define a default planner plan if we're using Microsoft Planner, default buckets, default tasks to manage our project effectively. Again, if we're doing something very repetitive, think how long it will take to set this up manually. Here's one of the good bits. We can also define default lists and libraries. In those, we can define things like default folder structures. And some of my particular favorites, we can also define things like limits on the number of versions to stop sprawl of many versions consuming your storage. We can define default content types synchronized from the content type hub, so predefined ways you capture and manage your documents. We can also define the sensitivity label and retention labels to be applied to that document library. So you can have different rules for different document libraries and consistently apply these to make sure that your documents are retained. So getting very granular about the structure. I showed you that we can control things like the privacy, guest access, sharing settings, sensitivity. We can also define rules around the naming, and it uses a formula builder type concept. So any of the metadata which you captured from the user, the name, the custom metadata which you asked for, as well as the properties of the requester who made the request from Entra ID, so things like their department, their location, can be used in a naming convention. You can use fixed values, you can use random or sequential numbering as well. So in my case, the project code is being set as a prefix to my site or team name. I've got a naming convention for my URL, SharePoint site URL. Very important. If you're creating hundreds or thousands of these, you need some consistency, you need some uniqueness, and you need some standards to be able to help to understand them and manage them. So we can get very granular in that setup and how those are configured. What does that team look like when it's been created? So we'll have a quick look to see if my team's been created yet. Here we go. So you can see here's my market research project. Notice that naming convention which is applied to that. Notice that the channels have been created with my structure which I've defined. In here, we'll see if the Files tab is going to load in any sort of reasonable time. It's always incredibly slow in the browser. I will have my predefined structure of folders. Within the ProvisionPoint app itself, we'll be able to come in and we'll be able to see some more settings which have been defined about this team. So here we can see again that naming convention. We can come in here and we can see more about that site and team. We can see the lease which is applied. We can see the owners who have been set. Note here's my SharePoint site URL. There's a naming convention applied to that as well. So it's using that naming convention. Oh, I didn't show you also, I'm linking to a hub site. So within the ProvisionPoint app, I can link all of my projects to a hub site for organization, a great way of managing structure in that more flat SharePoint structure which exists. I've got my lists here. So I've got my documents library with my folder structure, which I have defined. We can even include things like default files. If I go and look at my reports library, here it is with some default folders included, and even got my content type applied, and it will be applying my retention label to that as well. What else have we got going on here? Notice here that I've got a column here called project code. You might be wondering, oh, that's pretty similar to the project code which Peter set when he created that, exactly the same. So here I can go and create a new document. Let's call it spec of requirements, and I'm not very imaginative of content, so I'll just put some content there. But what I wanted to show you is that this file will be inheriting that metadata from the workspace. So there's so many really smart things which we can do around default structures, dynamic content from our metadata, but also from applying our labeling and classifications, which we need to do as well. Lastly, I just also wanted to mention the fact that from an owner's perspective, we can manage this workspace within the ProvisionPoint app. I can request changes. I can request additional structure be created. I can update that metadata. I can manage the security. I can change the privacy settings, all with additional workflow. All of these actions will be recorded in our timeline. And also the life cycle, which I showed previously, will show me the different stages in its life cycle journey. So we can get really smart about how these sites and teams are provisioned and created. We can define things like our structure of lists and libraries. We can link to hub sites. We can control our labeling, which gets applied to those. We can control many different aspects of what gets set up. And we can manage it in a secure, controlled provisioning way. I've also shown you the process directly through the ProvisionPoint app to make those requests. But if you have another way of initiating a project within your organization, say, for example, you create a project in your CRM system or something occurs in your finance system, ProvisionPoint also has its own API. So if you want to integrate with it to still do that smart provisioning, but triggering it in an automated way without even a user intervening, you can do that as well. So it's a very flexible tool to cover those different workloads and scenarios. So I'll return to the slide deck to sort of wrap up, and then we'll move on to any questions. So it's worth saying that from a project perspective, this is really great for working at scale. We work with another customer, Transport for London. I always use them because everyone's heard of them. They run the tubes and buses in London. They create something like 5 to 10 new teams a day using ProvisionPoint, so it can really cope with that sort of scale. It can even cope with when you need to create a lot of sites and teams at once. You can create sites and teams on bulk. You can provide it with a CSV of workspaces and say, actually just go and provision all of these from a template. Maybe you're in a migration scenario, maybe you're bringing data from network drives and you want to bulk create things. Those pre-configured templates allow you to have your structure, your taxonomy, your naming. They do many more things as well. I just showed you a few highlights today. And it also helps with the labeling. We've worked with a number of government organizations, local government, national government, across the world on how they ensure that that labeling is correctly applied. We are integrating heavily with Purview. We're applying all of your settings from Purview, but what we're doing is we're automating and ensuring that those settings are applied consistently to the correct locations. And that probably brings me to the end of my presentation. So I think I'm going to hand it back to Steve or Mel to see if we've got any questions.
Peter, thank you very much for the demo. I think there's a few things here that just resonated with me going through this. The first one was really when you were doing that, provisioning the template and the complex setup. There's just a lot of manual steps to create a team and then assign a planner. And then if you're working in an organization where you are in multiple projects and you want to have visibility of that as a person that's working across a bunch of sites, having that consistency is absolute gold from the end user point of view, I think. Um, do you have sort of like best practice guides or around sort of the setup things that you would have, or you just say customize this specifically to an organization's needs and let them figure it out themselves?
Um, the advice I would always give
Yeah.
is start small. A lot of people
Yeah.
go into it thinking I've got to do many different things.
Mm.
It always works well if you start off with 2 to 3 templates at most to start with. Focus on the use cases which are really important to you. It might be that you want to control external access. It might be that you want a very specific and customized template. That's fine. Just identify those core use cases. Don't try and design for every individual scenario because it will it will take too long and you'll never get them all right. I think the second thing I would say is we can give good guidance around what other people are doing, but it does tend to be personalized to the organization. A lot of people ask me, how long does it take to set up ProvisionPoint? It's actually a very simple application to set up and configure, as long as you know what you want to achieve, as long as you've done that groundwork to define what is it I need to apply, what is it I need to control, and you will honestly grow into the product. Some people might be a bit daunted by all of the capabilities. That's fine. Most of our customers take time to adopt all of those capabilities. Focus on the things which are the biggest pain.
That's good advice. Thank you, Peter. If anybody's got any questions, if you do pop them into the chat now, we've got one here. This has come through. So the question is from Emmy, and it is, on average, how long does it take for the end users to be trained or gain confidence using the self-provisioning?
It's quite quick. Typically we don't engage directly with the training of the end users ourselves. I always think that that's something better coming from the organization, because there's an explanation which needs to be put around it and the governance rules. I think it's relatively intuitive. So my experience is that the rollout to the end users and the training of end users is typically done in quite a short time frame. So a couple of weeks of elapsed time. It's the simplest part of the implementation. I have seen examples of where people will put things like guides or videos, or wrap this in like a good practice governance site within SharePoint to give the users more clarity. But I think my experience is that the rollout to users is quite quick and can normally be achieved within a couple of weeks, dependent on your users and your experience working with your users. But that's what I've seen.
Peter, and just expanding on the provisioning piece, is it possible to create templates that are restricted to specific groups of people? So, for example, we might have a PMO that is responsible for setting up projects, so giving them the PMO project templates only.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, if you see here, I see 4 templates available for me to request. But if I actually switch to the administrative experience here, you'll actually see there's 5. So I can control that just based on my Entra ID security to say who has access to what. So a classic example is the one you described of only project managers can request these workspaces. Only people who have completed suitable training can create a team for external access. It's very configurable like that. You might even, within larger organizations, have different templates for different business units or different organizational areas.
Yeah, that's great. Has anyone else got any questions?
I'll answer a question which I often get asked, which is building on the previous question about how long does it take to train end users, which is often I get asked, how long does it take to implement ProvisionPoint within your organization? My general guidance is it's in the region of 6 to 8 weeks for a sort of small to mid-size organization. If you've got a reasonably strong idea around the challenge, what you're trying to achieve. If you don't, then it will take a little bit longer, because you need to spend more time planning and thinking about what your templates are, what your policies, controls are. Even if it's where it's an interactive process and we're giving guidance, you still need to have that thinking time. It can be done quicker. We managed it in 2 weeks the other day. It can take longer, where you've got a lot of stakeholders and you've got a lot of IT controls and other things to consider.
Yeah. Final question, Peter, before we wrap up would be, obviously ProvisionPoint's got a portal that you're logging in, so you're accessing through the web. But do the templates themselves stay inside? Whereabouts is the templates and policies stored? Are they in the user tenant or are they in the ProvisionPoint service?
Yeah, so the templates themselves, the configuration of the templates and the policies are hosted in our SaaS service, which runs in Microsoft Azure. And we have a data center, different regional data centers around the world to help with customer locations and data residency concerns. All of the data which gets managed, all of the teams which get created, all of the data you then store in those teams are stays within your tenant. So what ProvisionPoint is doing is managing the process of how those sites and teams are created with those guardrails, and then the policy enforcement and the application of policies. Obviously, things like purview labels still remain in your tenant. All we're doing is automating the application of those.
Great. Well, Peter, thank you very much for your time today. Thanks for presenting to us on this webinar. If anyone has follow-on questions or would like to learn a bit more, if they could just contact Mel. Mel's email address is on the screen at the moment, and we're happy to arrange a demo or to answer any questions that you might have following today's session. Yeah, thanks very much for attending. We'll wrap it up now. Thank you.
Thank you.